Hello, everybody. Oh my goodness me. This is the first video of semester 2. Oh my gosh, we're starting out strong with unit 5. Like I said in my last video, I might update some of the videos going forward, but for the most part, they're pretty much going to be uh not that much of a change. I think I'll redo the French Revolution one because I want to tighten that up a little bit. It's so interesting to go into the French Revolution, but you don't really need to know all that much for the AP. Really, all you would need to know are causes and effects. I kind of go a little too much into the events of the French Revolution. I admit it. I think it's very fascinating. But regardless of the case, this is going to bring us to a new unit, actually, and we're going to enter into more recognizable history in many ways. We are going to enter into the more modern world, into the more early, or not early modern world, into the more later modern world. And actually, the end of this particular unit is 1900, is the 20th century. So a little more than 100 years ago by day of recording. So without further ado, let's get started. Your bell work on the screen right here. This is more of a opinion. In your opinion, what were the 5 most significant events, empires, or people from last semester? So it could be anyone, really. Whoever you think is important, don't need to describe it. Oh my God, here we go. So yes, we are on Unit 5, and Unit 5 is actually my favorite unit because we are going to talk about a period of profound change in many, many ways, not just in the Americas and Europe, but we'll also see, especially in our next unit, that this profound change will impact the rest of the world. And indeed, we are going to look at massive changes in this unit of revolutions. And one of those changes, as we're going to see more in our later presentations, starting about chapter 4, I believe, is that we're going to look at economic changes. We'll first begin by looking at some political developments. We'll talk about political and ideological revolutions, including things like the American, French, Haitian, Latin American independence movements. All of these different revolutions we'll talk about later on. But we're going to also look at economic changes as well. This is the period where we start talking about the Industrial Revolution, a period of profound economic change, as we will see, and technological change as well. But we can't discuss this technological and economic change without first talking about political change. And that's why we talk about political revolutions first in this unit. So yes, we are going to start looking at what we call in history the Age of Revolutions. And what we mean by this term is the period of political changes. And we're going to look at a few political revolutions in the Americas, meaning both what will become the United States and various Latin American countries. But we'll also look at revolutions in Europe, namely the French Revolution and its aftershocks, its after impacts. Thus, an objective today is asking you to focus on the causes of these revolutions. We're going to be able to explain the ideas behind these revolutions. We're going to go back to the Enlightenment, actually. We'll talk about that in a political context. And we're going to see how the Enlightenment will impact societies over time. We are going to explore the Enlightenment and its political philosophy today. That will help us understand the French, American, and the Latin American independence movements. But today we're going to focus on the Enlightenment, and then we're going to look at the first Enlightenment-inspired revolution in my favorite country of the world, the United States of America. But we'll get there in just a second. It's not my favorite country. Anyway, so before we begin, I want you right now to think in your head, what do you mean by the term revolution? And in class, you would talk to your neighbor. You would come up with great definitions. You would raise your hands. I would pick on some people for some answers. But I want you to kind of put into perspective what exactly a revolution is. Because a revolution can mean a lot of different things. A revolution, a way to think about it, is thinking about what we mean by revolution in geometry. Because when we think about things like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution, those last two are going to happen in the 20th century, we tend to think about a period of profound change where you start with one thing and it becomes something new. It becomes a 180. But if we think about the definition of a revolution in astronomy or geometry, a revolution is a circle. You start with one thing, you go all the way around, and you end at the same thing. You might have gone a bit of a change. You might have gone through some transition. But at the end of the day, things still remain the same. And historians are often divided on how revolutionary, how much significant change happened as a result of political revolutions. Because a political revolution, in many ways, could mean a profound change, or it could just be the same people who were in charge before are still in charge. And that's something you should kind of keep in the back of your mind. Do things profoundly change? Do people in power profoundly change as a result of these political revolutions? Because if we're thinking about things like the American or Latin American independence movements, colonial elites are going to be the elites after independence is achieved. So keep that in the back of your mind for a second. But first and foremost, let's define a few things before we look at the Enlightenment. Indeed, as I said before, we are entering in a new period of world history, sometimes referred to as the Age of Revolutions. And we are going to mostly focus on a few of these revolutions. But what exactly do we mean by this term right here? Well, the Age of Revolutions describes a period of world history between the end of the 18th century, the 1700s, and about the mid-1800s. This is a period of profound political and ideological change across the Atlantic world. And the Atlantic world refers to countries that border the Atlantic Ocean, so North, South America, and Europe. We'll talk about Africa more in our Unit 6, but we're mostly going to focus on societies in Europe, North, and South America in this unit, in these particular chapters of this unit. But these revolutions, these political and ideological changes are largely going to be influenced by the Enlightenment, as we are going to see more in just a second. And most of these revolutions we characterize as liberal revolutions. And what exactly is liberalism? Because you might have heard it thrown around in the news nowadays, but in historic context, and generally even to this day, liberalism refers to this idea that a society should have a republican government, meaning that there should be representatives who are elected by people to represent them in government. And this government, formed by elected representatives, this government has a responsibility to protect certain rights, namely private property. So liberal revolutions are going to characterize much of this period of profound change. We are going to see the creation or the experimentation of liberal governments in Europe and North and South America. These liberal governments are going to be, in theory, elected representative republics. However, as we're going to definitely see, they overwhelmingly will favor wealthy middle-class people, wealthy white middle-class people, as we will see. And we'll kind of refresh our memory what we mean by middle class in just a second. But it's people who own property who aren't in the nobility. And there are a few examples of the revolutions we'll talk about, and I'm going to just briefly mention what they are. We're going to talk about the American Revolution today, actually, the French Revolution, that's next presentation, the Haitian Revolution, also next presentation. It's kind of a spin-off. I want to characterize it that way, but it will happen around the same time as the French Revolution, but also the various Latin American independence movements. Spanish and later on Portuguese colonies will break away from those empires and form their own independent countries, places like Mexico, Argentina, etc. But we'll also talk about some other European revolutions. We'll briefly mention the revolutions of 1830 and more, also briefly, but a little bit more detail, the revolutions of 1848. But generally, what is going to cause these revolutions? Well, in history, we tend to look at both short-term, so immediate causes, and long-term causes. So a long-term cause of me yelling at my cat is stress or something like that, stress from school. A short-term is the cat getting into the garbage, for example. I haven't been yelling at my cats recently. But let's look at some short-term causes. And generally, all of these revolutions will be caused in the short term by government problems. Government problems, especially in this question of how do we pay for things? Because as we saw with the age of colonization, as we saw with the age of exploration, it's really expensive to maintain overseas colonial empires. It's really expensive to maintain mercantilism. So there are going to be kind of, in all of these revolutions, the kind of thing that will set it off is this government question of how do we best pay for things? And one of those kind of things, one example of that is going to be the 7 Years' War. How do we, as the British Empire, pay for this costly war? Well, we've got to develop some new taxes. How do we as French people pay for our assistance of the Americans in their war for independence? Well, we've got to raise taxes. How do we as Latin American colonists, you get the idea. Generally, we are going to see that governments in Europe are going to kind of debate about how to best increase their revenue. And that increased revenue comes through taxes. And these taxes are placed on their colonies, for example, or their subjects, without any real representation. French middle-class people are not represented in their government. American colonists are not represented in the British government. So the question of taxation without representation is generally a short-term cause of all of these revolutions. And we'll explore that more in the future. But more importantly is understanding the concept of these long-term causes. What are some underlying issues that make these short-term crises more impactful? Well, one of those long-term causes is something that we started exploring way back in Unit 3, actually, in Europe anyway. And it's the growth of the middle class. Remember, in many societies across the Atlantic community in Europe and European colonies, there are really kind of three classes. There's the nobility, who control government, the middle class. These people are merchants and bankers. They're wealthy individuals. They have private property. It's just they're not represented in government at all. And below this middle class, it's the working or lower classes. We're going to stop using the term lower classes. I'll explain later why. But we do kind of see that this middle class, they're not poor. They're just not in government. And they definitely think they have a right to representation. They have a natural right to representation. So we are going to see that kind of, even though this middle class is developing as a result of commercialization, they're still not represented in government. They believe they have some sort of right to have their voices heard in government. And generally, this middle class that is emerging, it tends to be opposed to any restrictions on trade, any restrictions on the economy, namely mercantilism, but they're also against the idea that power should be wielded absolutely by an individual, by one person. So these middle-class people tend to be opposed to absolutism. That's going to be especially true in the French Revolution. Another cause of these revolutions, at least with the cases of Latin American independence, Haitian Revolution, and the American Revolution, is the growth of something we call nationalism. And that applies to the American, Haitian, and Latin American revolutions, not the French. But what is nationalism? We've been kind of dancing around this topic, and we'll explore it more. We'll explore it more in our next presentation, actually. But nationalism, in a nutshell, is the idea that a people with a common culture, a common language, they should be a single, unified nation. And nationalism tends to be a cause of independence movements. That's why I'm saying it's more relevant for the Latin American, Haitian, and American revolutions. The idea that we're American, we're not British, we are American, we should have our own nation. We should be an independent American nation. We're from Mexico. We're not Spanish. We're not represented in Spain at all. We should be our own Mexican nation. And we'll talk about Latin America later on. But generally, kind of the idea of a unique national culture that is separate from a colonial empire. That's a major cause for the American, Latin American, and Haitian revolutions, not the French. A result of the French Revolution, as we'll see, is nationalism, but we'll get there. But finally, one of the most significant long-term causes of these various revolutions is the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is a majorly important intellectual event we actually introduced in Unit 3. The Enlightenment, as you remember, was a period of intellectual curiosity that believed in secularism. It believed in approaching the natural world rationally. And we kind of see the philosophical ideas of the Enlightenment, that it's pro-secularism, that it is opposed to unrational thought. But another big part of the Enlightenment, as we're going to see in a second, is that every human being, or at least every man, has natural rights. They have rights. They have special privileges given to them merely from their birth, merely from being alive, merely from being human, and that no one can take that away without government consent. But every human being, at least every man, is entitled to some form of natural rights. That's what we're going to explore in just a second. So the Enlightenment is a major long-term cause of these various revolutions, especially this idea that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, which among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the Enlightenment is this concept politically that all human beings, that all men, I should say, have rights given to them from nature, and that government is designed to protect those rights, not take them away. So let's look at some Enlightenment beliefs. So in general, though, that idea of rationality is a big part of this political aspect of the Enlightenment, this idea of how do we make society, how do we make government more rational? Well, we need to recreate government. We need to reform government designed to run more efficiently and fairly in order to preserve those natural rights. And there are a few Enlightenment thinkers I'm going to throw out at you. I would kind of at least memorize two of them, just so you have some background information for your AP preparation. For one thing, we have Enlightenment thinkers like Baron de Montesquieu, this guy that kind of looks like Palpatine right here. I've been playing a lot of Star Wars related things. Anyway, Baron de Montesquieu, who was he? Well, he was a French philosopher that essentially believed in order so we have a less corrupt government, in order so we have a more efficient government, we need to kind of separate power into different branches. So a major kind of result, a major example of Montesquieu's thinking is actually how the American government works, as we'll explore later on. Power is not just in one person. It is divided between three different branches that have equal but separate. No. That have checks and balances on each other. That's what I meant to say. So there's a president, there's Congress, there's the Supreme Court, there's a system of checks and balances. No one branch has more power. And that's a pretty radical thought if we're thinking of this idea of absolutism, the idea that only one person should have all political power. So Montesquieu is one example of an Enlightenment philosopher who dabbles in politics, this idea that government should be more, the powers of government should be separated into different branches to prevent dictatorship, essentially. Voltaire is another French philosopher. Voltaire believes that government should be secular. Government should not have any influence by religion. He believes in a quote-unquote purely scientific form of governing. Voltaire famously was a quasi-atheist, and he believed that government should be secular, but also to reduce tensions within a society, religious freedom should be granted to everybody. Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists, Pastafarians, all these people should have religious freedom. Some other some other Enlightenment philosophers stress this notion of natural rights. One such example is John Locke. John Locke was an English philosopher who believed that government had a responsibility to protect three things: life, liberty, property. And that if a government decided not to protect these three things, it was a right of the people to do a revolution, to change government. Interesting concept. Another guy that stressed the notion of natural rights and that idea of representation in government is a French philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau believed in this notion of the consent of the governed, that governments are only there because we, the people, say that they're there, and that government has a responsibility, a social contract to protect our natural rights. And that one of those rights is the right to have a voice in government if you're a white man with property. And speaking of property, there are some economic theories that are somewhat related to the Enlightenment, one of them being the ideas of Adam Smith. And Smith, we'll talk about him more in an economic context later. But Adam Smith believed that the most efficient economy is capitalism, is the system of private property ownership where individuals own the means of production, and that these individuals have a right to own those means of production without government influence. So guys like Adam Smith are opposed to mercantilism. They believe that government should promote what we call free trade. And basically, free trade is trade that's not restricted by any government. It's the opposite of mercantilism. So Adam Smith is a big proponent of capitalism, of free trade, and his ideas are going to be very much picked up on by the middle class, a group of people who want their private property protected. It's not really a coincidence Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, his book about capitalism, basically, in 1776, the same year something happened in what will become the United States, the American Declaration of Independence, but we'll get there. But who actually listened to the Enlightenment? Well, I'm just going to say this right now. It wasn't poor people because public education wasn't a thing. But there are some people who will pick up on the influence of the Enlightenment. Some political leaders will, actually. And we have a group of absolute despots, absolute monarchs, known as enlightened despots. These are kings and queens who saw that the Enlightenment was about rationality. And to them, that means efficiency. If we have a more rational government, if we had a more rational taxation system, maybe we can centralize our power a lot more effectively. Maybe we can get people to support us by supporting and protecting some natural rights while retaining absolute power. And that's what an enlightened despot is. Some examples of that are, well, we've talked about her before, but Catherine the Great, but also this guy from Prussia. So that's Prussia, named, did I say that right? Prussia, named Frederick the Great. And an enlightened despot, just one more time, that's essentially an absolute ruler who makes some Enlightenment-inspired reforms, but they still have absolute power. However, enlightened despots are kind of a rare thing. They're not extremely common throughout Europe, especially not in France. But who really is going to pick up on the Enlightenment, especially that notion of representation in government being a natural right, and that government has a responsibility to protect private property? Well, it's mostly going to be the middle class. Remember, the middle class refers to people who own a lot of private property. Groups like bankers and merchants, printers. Who else was in the American Revolution? Beer manufacturers, brewery owner people. So this idea that private property, that property is a natural right, that's going to be really picked up by the middle class. And they believe governments should exist that promote the protection of private property. And that in order for governments to protect that private property, in order to make sure they do that basic function, government should be made up of middle class people through a representative form of government, through a republic. So a lot of middle class people, they're going to actually be the pushers of these liberal revolutions during the age of revolutions. They're pushing for governments that protect private property. And how do we make sure government always has the best interest of middle class people at heart? Well, we need to have elections where middle class people can vote for representatives who promise to protect private property. And one example of kind of a middle-class Enlightenment thinker is Benjamin Franklin, actually, from the American colonies, from the British North American colonies. Benjamin Franklin was he was a super wealthy guy, but he wasn't a noble. He was a huge publisher, and he believed that there is a government responsibility to protect that private property. Also, this idea of individualism, that private property is one of those individual rights that must be protected. And private property can only be taken away if there is government consent, and that government has to pass laws through representation. But the Enlightenment does inspire, and this is something that is important for the AP, the Enlightenment does inspire some reform movements. Certainly it inspires liberal middle-class revolutionaries to reform their governments and do things like the American and French Revolution. But there also is going to be push from groups of people who typically don't have any place in society, that typically don't have that big of a voice in society. And that includes both women and enslaved people. we are going to see that the Enlightenment does inspire early feminist movements. And what we mean by feminism, essentially the idea that women, at this point in feminist history, that at this point, women are also entitled to natural rights, things like property, even things like divorce and literally not being regarded as your husband's property. These sorts of things. That's what early feminist thinkers are pushing for. And one example of that is Mary Wollstonecraft. This is the mom of Mary Shelley, actually, interestingly enough. Mary Shelley, anyone know who she wrote or what she wrote? Frankenstein, actually. Anyway, so Mary Wollstonecraft, an example of how the Enlightenment will influence early feminism. Wollstonecraft believed that women are also entitled to natural rights. It's not just rich white men, but also rich white women as well. Another area where the Enlightenment does inspire reform movements is abolition to a degree. And abolition, remember, is the idea of abolishing slavery. Slavery pretty much takes away human beings' natural rights. So abolitionism will be, to a degree, inspired by the Enlightenment. However, even though the Enlightenment does inspire movements for gender equality and racial equality, the Enlightenment is mostly going to cater to rich, property-owning, white men. And I emphasize property owning for that rich part right there, just to connect this idea of government should protect private property. So the Enlightenment is, again, going to mostly be confined to rich white men. And as we're going to see with all of these revolutions, it's wealthy, rich, white men who were in charge of society before these revolutions. And with some exceptions, they're going to still be in charge after the revolution. And that's definitely true in the American, French, and a lot of Latin American revolutions. But we'll explore that more later. So in class, I would show this video right here. It's basically all about the Enlightenment and how its ideas are going to influence revolutions. In kind of this case, it's the American Revolution. We'll watch that in class. So you should be able to identify causes of the age of revolution. So identify some of those reasons why it happened. All right, so we're going to switch gears now. We're going to talk about the American Revolution, and this is something you don't need to write down for your unit worksheet, but what do you already know about the American Revolution? Because some of you might have taken an American history class before, and a lot of these ideas might sound familiar. So yes, let's talk about the first Enlightenment-inspired political revolution of the 18th century, and that is going to be the revolution that will establish the greatest country in the world, the American Revolution. And funnily enough, what I'm about to cover covers units 1 through 3 of AP US history, funnily enough, at least in the way that UHS teaches it. So let's take a look at the American Revolution. And why is it significant in world history? Well, I'm just going to straight up say right now, it's going to be the first Enlightenment-inspired revolution. And as a result of that, it's going to inspire other revolutions, other anti-colonial revolutions, both in the 19th century and the 20th century, as we'll see later on. It will also inspire the French Revolution in a variety of ways. So what is going to cause the American Revolution? Well, as we're going to see in just a second, the American Revolution, it contains a lot of different things. It will be the creation of an Enlightenment-inspired government, but it's also going to be the creation of an independent country. So what will cause this independence war, and what will cause this political revolution? So some causes. Well, long-term causes, we've got the Enlightenment. Keep that in the back of your mind for now. But we've also got this idea that, remember, in British colonies, these colonial governments, for the most part, really until the period that we're going to talk about right now were mostly self-governing, meaning that they had their own colonial governments. They had their own representative colonial governments that managed themselves, that taxed themselves. And really, the British government back in England wasn't really involved in what went on within the colonies. And because of that, these British North American colonies have unique identities that aren't necessarily British. They feel more American. They feel more New Yorker and they feel more New Yorker than they feel British. They feel more from Massachusetts than they feel from the British. So the creation of an American national culture, that is a big result of how little the British government interfered in colonial business, at least until the 1700s. And that's really going to describe the short-term cause. What will change the British government's presence in the colonies? Because it's going to go from basically zero to a lot more than zero. And largely that is going to find itself in how the British government, for the first time, is going to start levying or charging taxes on these previously untaxed colonists. And that's mostly going to happen because of a desire by the British government for more money. Because there's this thing that happened in the 1700s called the 7 Years' War. It was this international war that caused, or that saw basically all the European countries fight it out. And they fought it everywhere, in Europe, in India, but also in North America as well. The French and the British, they fought each other. Guess what? The British won. Hooray! But it costs a lot of money to win a war. And in order to pay for that war, the British believe they need to start taxing the people they were protecting during that war. So we start to see the levying, the charging of taxes, things like the stamp tax, which was a tax on every piece of paper, basically, and literally every piece of printed paper. The tea tax, which was a tax on tea. But there are other taxes as well. I just emphasized two right there. But this is a big, big change because these taxes are new, for one thing, but they were put on the colonies without the consent of the colonists. There was no American colonist representative in the British Parliament. So this is the origin of that idea of no taxation without representation. Hey, you're going to charge taxes on us. We should have a say in government if that's okay or not. But there is no there is no American representative in the British Parliament. So there's taxation without representation. And that is a big deal to these Enlightenment-inspired colonists, these Enlightenment middle-class thinkers. We're giving up our private property, but we have no say in the matter. There is no consent of the governed, and the government is taking away what we view as a natural right. So this does lead to a lot of protests. It gets more complicated. There's this thing called the Boston Tea Party. And then the British government is like, you're going to throw tea overboard? Well, we're going to send in the military to occupy Boston. And then all the colonists are like, oh no, what if the military came into our cities? What if they took away our colonial representative government? What if they took away the colonial legislature? So there are fears that the British government would start to step in even more, station troops in their cities, put them in their homes. That's called quartering. And that's eventually what will lead to the American War for Independence. It really is this kind of outrage over these new taxes. The governments of the British colonies, they start to get together and they're like, how do we defend against the British occupying our troops? Well, let's form our own military. And this military and the British military, they fight each other. It's the American War for Independence. So that's one short-term cause, is that these new taxes that were previously not there are going to inspire protests. These protests will inspire military conflict. There's also this other thing that causes the American War for Independence. It's this thing called the Proclamation of 1763. Essentially, the British government is like, okay, we don't want to defend British colonists from Native Americans, so we're just going to draw this line right here. American colonists, you can't go past this line. You'll upset the Native Americans. But British colonists are like, what the hell? We want to settle where we want to. Isn't it our God-given natural right to own property where we want? Government can't restrict that, even though it's protecting us from Native Americans. Anyway, all these factors will lead to the American War for Independence. So really, the American Revolution is interesting because it's not just the War for Independence. Quite frankly, that doesn't matter all that much. All you would need to know about the American War for Independence is like three things. For one thing, it made the United States a country, so that's pretty self-explanatory. Two, the French get involved. They help out the Americans. The Americans are like, hey, France, we don't like the British. Can you help us out? And then France, hating the British, is like, sure, we'll help you out, Americans. So it bankrupts the French. That's going to cause the French Revolution, as we're going to see later on. And then the third thing, it's the first anti-colonial war in world history. You could use that as context for future anti-colonial wars in, say, Africa or Asia in the 20th century. Anyway, the American War for Independence happens. The United States wins. Hooray. We get help from the French. Awesome. But what matters more for us is the political changes as a result of the American War for Independence. Because the War for Independence is going to create a new country, and a new country needs a government. So let's look at kind of what will result from this need for a new government. But first, let's look at some of the beliefs of the American revolutionaries. Well, the American revolutionaries genuinely believe, or generally, I should say, believe these things right here. They believe that there should be a government based on what they called actual representation. And actual representation essentially is the idea that government has to be made up of people who are directly elected to serve their interests. So say a person from the citizens of Tucson, we vote for a representative from Tucson who goes to Washington, D.C. and expresses our concerns. Everyone in Tucson is concerned that there's not enough EGs. Or let me get a better example. People from Arizona want to make a national park, which is kind of, that's also a bad example because that would never happen. Let's just use a local example. There's too many potholes. Oh no, we need money from the state government to give us money for the Jesus Christ. Anyway, you know what actual representation is. It essentially is the idea that in order for a group of people to be governed, they need to have a choice. They need to have a voice in who makes those decisions. There needs to be elections for representatives who serve their constituents' best interests. So the idea of actual representation, big part of the American Revolution. Also the idea of a meritocracy. There is no nobility in the United States, at least in paper, in theory anyway. So this idea of meritocracy, that only the best and brightest from their natural abilities should be in government, not based simply on what family you belong to. There should be free trade. Government should not restrict any trade at all, even if that means millions of people dying, whatever. And also, government has to protect basic civil liberties. They have to protect natural rights, things like the freedom of speech, things like the freedom of religion, the right to assemble, the right to petition the government, the right to own bear arms. Bear arms. Anyway. However, as we will see in other revolutions, most of these Atlantic world revolutions are not going to include people of color, women, or people without property, meaning poor people. So we do see that even though there will be some changes, as we'll see in just a second, this is not going to include women, people of color, meaning slaves as well. It certainly doesn't include African Americans. It doesn't include Native Americans. It doesn't include immigrants. It includes basically like just certain types of white people from like certain parts of Germany, certain parts of England and Scotland and France. So one thing that generally is true about these revolutions in this time period, and again, I'm going to say this one more time, is that civil liberties are restricted. The right to participate in government is restricted to rich, white men. We'll see how that kind of changes in the future. But there are some important Enlightenment-inspired American revolutionary documents. One of them is pretty obvious, as we'll see in a second. One of them is something called Common Sense. Common Sense was a pamphlet produced by this guy named Thomas Paine, and it essentially espoused all of these ideas of republicanism and meritocracy, that government should not be made up of nobles, it should be made up of the people. And by the people, we meant people that had property. And anyone can own property in theory, right? So Common Sense, that's one document that's related to the Enlightenment. It's an example of the Enlightenment's influence on the American Revolution. Thomas Paine argues that we need to have a republican form of government. We need to be free from the British because they are not American. And even though Paine wasn't American. Anyway, you'll learn about this more in A+. You don't really need to know that much. I'm just kind of getting into it because this is my area of study. There's the American Declaration of Independence, which will, declare our independence, but it is going to be another example of an Enlightenment-inspired document. It is going to say that all men are created equal, that they have certain rights that are given to them merely by being alive that include things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, whatever the heck that means, Thomas Jefferson. So the Declaration of Independence is an important document. It essentially is going to declare American independence, and it is inspired by Enlightenment ideas. The idea that government has to respect certain natural rights, and that if government doesn't respect those natural rights, we, the people, have a responsibility to overthrow that government. And guess what? The American colonists, they overthrew what they called an oppressive government, even though by comparison it wasn't the most oppressive government of Europe. Anyway, finally, one of the most important Enlightenment-inspired documents that is an example of the American Revolution is the Constitution. The Constitution, it's going to be ratified in 1789, and it essentially is going to be the document that will outline what the American government looks like. But here's where the Enlightenment inspires all of this. So for one thing, a part of the Constitution is a document tacked on later called the Bill of Rights. Essentially, these are a list of rights government has to respect. They include 10 things that the American Constitution people thought government should protect. Government should protect the freedom of speech. Government should protect the freedom of religion. Government should protect the right to own property without it being taken away, except if you're convicted for a crime. And just as a side note, property to these people included, slaves. So there's that. There's also this idea that government should be made up of people who are elected to represent people in government. So we have something called the House of Representatives, and this is one of the bodies of government that is made up of people elected by American citizens. However, it should be noted at this point, citizens include people who own property, more specifically, men who own property, more specifically, white men who own property. So this idea that we have to have a government made up of the will of the people, the consent of the governed, that's where Rousseau comes into all of this. There's this idea that no one person in government should be more powerful. There's this idea of separate branches. There's a executive, the president. There's Congress, the legislative. There's the judicial branch, and that's like the Supreme Court and stuff. But there's also this concept known as federalism. And federalism essentially is what the United States has. There is a national government, so a government that applies to all the different states equally. And then there are state governments. There's a balance of power between the federal government and state governments. So the government of Arizona, to use that example right there, that's influenced by Montesquieu. But there's also kind of in the Constitution this language about what exactly are the responsibilities of government. Well, the responsibilities of government include things like, hold on, let me get the song. We the people. In order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. I could have said that in a lot better way, but I forgot the Schoolhouse Rock song. Essentially, government has a responsibility to promote stability. The government has a responsibility to promote the general welfare, meaning the economy of the nation. And that's influenced by Adam Smith, actually. Adam Smith believed that government had a responsibility to protect people, so have a military, to ensure that there is an equal justice system. So all of these ideas are going to be the kind of thinking of the framers of the American Constitution. The government has the responsibility to protect these things to promote economic development. The government should not interfere in business. The government should be hands off and let business people do whatever the heck they want. And that essentially is something we will talk about more in the future, but it's kind of the idea of laissez-faire, the idea of let them do as they please. Government has a limited role in the economy. Business people can do what they want because business people have private property, and private property is something respected by our lovely Constitution. So you should be able to identify how the Enlightenment and its ideas are expressed in the American Revolution. What are some examples of these things? I don't know. Some examples could include those literally 3 documents I just talked about. And this is something else you could use to answer that, because all of these ideas are Enlightenment ideas found in the Constitution. The idea of consent of the governed, the separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, this idea of state and federal government, Rousseau, the idea of direct democracy, Voltaire, and then also no cruel or unusual punishment, that government should not have a torture program that is going to be aimed at people not convicted of a crime who come from different countries, and that are locked away in a small military base in Cuba that we illegally own. Anyway, that's a different thing. All right. Cool. That's the Enlightenment and the American Revolution. What results from all of this jazz? Well, it's going to benefit some people, not benefit other people. That's basically the summary of this slide right here. So let's look at the results of the American Revolution. Well, one of the big results is, well, the creation of a new country, for one thing. But politically speaking, we see the American Revolution is important because it is one of the first Enlightenment-inspired revolutions, and it's going to produce an Enlightenment-inspired government, an Enlightenment-inspired constitution. So we've had constitutions in the past, the English Bill of Rights, for example, but this is the first one influenced directly by the Enlightenment. But another thing is related to that point I just brought up earlier, that there's a new country. There's a new country that is developing its own national identity, its own national culture. So we do see the development of American nationalism. We do see the creation of an American culture. And that's kind of interesting in a way, because remember, America at this point, and even to this day, made up of immigrants. So how do we unite all of these people from different parts of Europe, around the world, basically? We need to create a national culture. And the creation of an American national culture kind of develops American civic culture. There are different things that relate to American culture. There's no aristocracy. We feel kind of proud that all people, that nobody's better than you, basically, that a CEO is at the end of the day at the same level as a janitor, for example. There's no aristocracy. There's no nobility in the United States. American culture also very much promotes property ownership. I mean, politically, in order to vote, you need to own property. So there's that. But also this idea of individualism. All of these things are considered key aspects of American culture. And certainly they are protected in things like the Constitution. However, this idea of property ownership, this idea of having a national culture, that is going to express in different concepts. And one of them is going to be the idea of manifest destiny, the idea that it is a God-given right that Americans should control the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. So this idea of American national culture, what do Americans generally agree on? One of the things in the early American history is manifest destiny, even if that comes at the cost of Native Americans. So manifest destiny, the idea that the United States should expand from sea to shining sea, is an example of American nationalism that is certainly going to have a lot of impact on America's neighbors, including its indigenous population and Mexico, as we'll see later on. But there's also going to be this development of kind of an us versus them mentality. We see the creation of America versus the rest of the world, that America is a shining experiment in democracy that is superior to other countries. As we're going to see later on, nationalism also tends to have this idea of superiority over other societies. And one such example of that actually is the Monroe Doctrine. And essentially the Monroe Doctrine is a pledge by the United States that Europe cannot interfere or colonize North or South America, because that's our area. So the Monroe Doctrine is an example of American nationalism. It's basically the United States declaring to the rest of the world, you can't interfere in what goes on in North and South America. And I'll talk about the Monroe Doctrine more in the future. That's kind of a very bare bones explanation right there. But another impact of the American Revolution is leading us into our future chapters. The American Revolution, one of the most significant parts of it, is that it will help inspire other revolutions. Arguably, that's the most important thing from it. It will influence the French Revolution. Indirectly and directly, French revolutionaries will try to model what the United States does in its country. We also see that the Haitian Revolution, where the enslaved population of Haiti declares its independence. That's also somewhat inspired by the American Revolution. Same thing with Latin American independence revolutions. That's 3 units of APUSH condensed into like 5 slides. All right. This is kind of what I mean by manifest destiny, essentially the idea that America should expand from sea, Atlantic Ocean, to shining sea, the Pacific Ocean. Well, I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. All right, so you should be able to identify causes of the American Revolution, results of the American Revolution. All right, have a great, grand old day. Welcome to Unit 5. I love this unit so flipping much. God bless America.